Spirit is knocking on the door of your heart. All we have to do is let it in, open our hearts to the miraculous beauty of the divine. It just seems to hail at you sometimes. And I was having one of those moments. And I was thinking, what are we going to talk about on Wednesday? You know, Wednesday comes fast every week. And I thought, And I just breathed and put my head on my knees. And I heard, sometimes when I hear things from Spirit, it's almost like I hear it in like a voice. And I heard this verse. Now, I warned you that I was raised in a Christian background with the King James Version. And it was this passage from Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and sup with him and he with me. And for some reason that was so nourishing for me right then. I stand at the door and knock. You know, when we look at what we're dealing with in life happens, right? Sometimes it's really fun and sometimes it's another great opportunity to grow. You know, in those moments, Spirit is always there, standing at the door of our hearts, knocking, knocking, knocking. You know, and Spirit is making the affirmative move toward me. I stand at the door and knock. When we consider, you know, a lot of times when we talk in New Thought, we talk about, well, we would have all these wonderful things manifesting in our lives if we would just accept them, right? You hear that a lot. And sometimes it gets perverted into, if life isn't going so great right now, then maybe I'm doing something wrong. And there's always some well-meaning person who might come to you and say, so what's your limiting belief about that, right? And you're like, well, am I being blamed because things aren't going well? You know, it was a traffic accident, it made me late on the road. Like, is that my fault? You know, or whatever. But it's so, it's a kind of a perversion sometimes of the teachings to have a conversation about fault. When in actuality, it is a conversation about responsibility. But what we often don't emphasize is that there is Spirit pouring down who's knocking aside those boulders, knocking aside the constriction. We talked about how Spirit comes through, you know, these channels that are us, and depending on the size of the channel, right, and the quality of the water, you know, it makes the difference in our experience of the divine. And then often we're taking responsibility for, well, do I have a little channel? When it comes to prosperity, do I have a little channel? When it comes to relationships, do I have a little channel, right? And we often look at, you know, how do I expand it? And what I heard from that Bible verse was that I, of my own self, don't expand it. I may get my ego out of the way, but I am connected to a divine source that all I am saying is I am opening the door. I am opening the door and I am allowing the Spirit to push at the boundaries, to push at the limits, to expand the channels to which the divine flows through me. So whenever I'm in a situation where I'm looking at, wow, that situation, that was quite one right there, right? Spirit wants to expand inside of us as much as we want Spirit to expand inside of us. You know, it's I read in one of these old readings, it was the goat wants to give suck to the kid. And as much as the kid wants to have the food, the parent goat wants to feed it. It's a mutual need. And sometimes I think when we think we're the ones seeking God, and we don't realize or appreciate that God is seeking us right back. You know, have you ever loved someone so intensely that you just wanted to love them and you wanted them to love you in return? And that feeling of, I have all this for you, right? And often, particularly in romantic relationships, not necessarily with your kids, where you're saying, do you love me back? Well, I imagine Spirit is saying, do you love me back? Because Spirit wants us to open up to it as much as we want to open up to Spirit. I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, how do you hear the voice of Spirit? I was telling Annette this little story that I had read of this older man. He had gone to the doctor, and he told the doctor, you know, I'm really worried about my wife. The doctor says, you're fine, you're in perfect health. He says, I know, but I'm worried about my wife. I think she has a hearing problem. And he says, really? He says, well, maybe why don't you go home and test it? When she's in the other room, call from the other room with her back turned, you know, say something to her and see if she hears you. So he yells out when he gets home, honey, what's for dinner? Silence. Honey, what's for dinner? Silence. So finally he goes to her face and says, what's for dinner? She's like, for the third time, chicken. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're putting our hearing problem on somebody else. Somebody else has a hearing problem. God doesn't have a hearing problem, right? Who is supposed to be listening? If any man hears my voice, if all we have to do is look for the instances in our lives and put attention on the spaces where Spirit is making the moves on us. Spirit is saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. Spirit is saying, I want you to have the best. Spirit is saying, it gives me joy to see you happy. Spirit is saying, when you're in meditation, this is what bliss is. Do you get how much I love you? That's what Spirit is saying. Spirit is knocking on your door. And all we have to do is open our hearts and listen. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and sup with him, and he with me. I always wondered, okay, so somebody comes in and eats with you. Why do you have to eat with them right back? That never made sense to me. And so I started looking at it and thinking about it. Because it goes to this reciprocity, this idea of reciprocity with God that we've been exploring. This idea that when we allow Spirit into our lives, in every area of our lives, when we are a space of surrender, I allow Spirit to take this situation and transform it in the highest and best of everyone involved. I am surrendering to this. When we are that space of absolute trust, when we are that space of Spirit, not only are our lives transformed, but remember, transformation, atonement is never complete when it's just you. It's always got to be shared with someone else. So when we are transforming into the image of the divine, the highest image, a divine spark in us, the highest image of us, we are transforming other people. We transform other people in several ways. One is we are an energetic space of the divine. We become people who radiate more of the glow. Have you ever seen someone and you just see them like glowing with Spirit and you're like, wow, I want to be around them, and you get near them and you feel lighter and you notice something about them. You know, they've taken on that charisma of Spirit. And you look at that person and you're like, yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I get myself in them. I get the mirror of the goodness in me by just being around them. That's one way that we contribute to sharing the divine spark with other people. You know, a lot of times when we're in this space of divine spark, we're giving up our own ego. You know, we're giving up making people wrong. We're giving up giving power to situations. We're giving up, you know, being the victim in some circumstance, right? And every time we do that, every time we give up a space of our own opinion, we allow more space for God to be. Again, increasing the presence of divine Spirit in our reality. See, it's really important for us to realize that as much as we want God in our lives to expand these spaces, because that's why we're here. We're here doing spiritual development, right? As much as we want to expand that space, God wants to expand that space in us. And that's why we say, God is saying, I'm knocking at your door. Let me in. Listen for me. I'm all about you. You know, what we're doing in these Wednesday nights is we're talking about the core principles that were core principles of science of mind. And one of those is the triune nature of God. And every time I read that title, I'm like, oh God, that sounds so boring and so technical. But I put the Trinity of Being, which sounds better than the triune nature of God. But this is the teaching symbol. And you all have seen this, where this universal spirit of oneness comes down and you have the subjectivity or the soul and then things that are manifesting. So the universal spirit of oneness is that space in us that we've been talking about. The space where we expand our ability to have spirit show up in our lives. When we start talking about, I stand at the door and knock, and expanding our capacity for spirit, it's this space in here where there is an infinite divine source. And we have talked a lot about the infinite power of the divine and that it manifests in many forms. But we take our intentions and we put it into this universal law. And then this universal law is, we call it like soil. You put your intention into the universal law, no matter what your intention is, no matter what your thought is, no matter what you used your spiritual power to create, and whatever you created will show up here in your manifestation body, right? So anytime something happens, somebody will say, well, what did you put into the universal spirit so that it manifested that way, right? And so a lot of our task in this lifetime is sometimes to kind of take out these clogs in here, or the weeds we have in here. Because whatever we believe occurs, right? So if I believe that I'm blessed in every way, and I start looking for all the instances and places where, you know, I get lucky, then those things show up because I'm using my spiritual power to be able to do that. So when we look at the text, I stand at the door and knock. Which part of this is God knocking in? What part of this are we looking to expand? And I'm saying it's in here. That when we have the descent of spirit, that it's that space of allowing more and more and more of that spirit to manifest with us. You know, the other thing is that if Spirit says, I stand at the door and knock, what is that telling us about free will? It tells us that we have the ability to use our free will to keep God out. You know, there are spaces in my life where I'd rather not have to go into the whole I have faith thing about it, and I'd rather just handle it myself, right? But even that implies faith. It implies faith in myself and actually God in me to handle it. But sometimes our egos kind of get involved and they're like, I can do this. I know how to handle this, you know? And our egos go tromping off to war. And what do? We limit our experience of spirit by doing that. We always have free will. And you know, you look at people are always saying, why do we have evil in the world? Well, Ernest Holmes, the founder of religious science, was really clear. Things that, you know, show up that don't look that great are often because we have free will to do whatever we wanted to do. And we may have miscreated and used our free will to create something that maybe wasn't so great. But that doesn't mean that we're bad or wrong. We're just making mistakes. We're all just learning. We're all on a path. This is a curriculum. This is school. And so in that sense, it's really not a sin or something to be, you know, punishing ourselves for. One of the classes that I had taken, they were talking about karma. And they were saying that sometimes you can just tell Spirit, I learned my lesson. Instead of waiting for, you know, the great downpouring of evil wrath, you know, of hellfire to punish us every time we make a mistake. When we make a mistake, we can acknowledge, I made a mistake, I learned my lesson. If there's another lesson for me to learn, have me learn that with grace and ease. Have me learn that easily so that I can, if I need to make it right for someone, let me make it right for them. But I learned from my mistake. I learned something about myself from this. But if we make it, oh, I always blah, 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 then what do? We put it in there. And so that conversation really is a conversation about, knocking at the door and opening the door. What are we opening the door for? And so when we make the commitment that we're opening the door just for spirit, when we can make a commitment that we're opening our inner door just for a spirit that's only for us, that there is nothing against us, and we realize that, then our lives start to manifest in a different way. And it's very scientific. Life is a mirror. So what do we have faith in? If we know that when we allow spirit in, I will come in and sup with you and me with you. We'll eat together. So what that's telling me is that there is a spiritual nourishment, that there is a spiritual growth, that there is a spiritual beauty and a bliss that's available for me right now as I open that door. So when we start talking about having faith, we have faith in knowing that there is only that good. And it becomes very simple. Whenever we're experiencing fear or trauma or when something happens, it's very simple. All we have to do is look at that. I think this is on. It was funny because Annette was looking at quotes and she put a quote on the bulletin, and it was the exact same quote that I had in my notes and hadn't shared them with her. What do you think about that? When prayer removes distrust and doubt and enters the field of mental clarity, it becomes faith, and the universe is built on faith. When prayer removes distrust and doubt, this is from our founder, Ernest Holmes. When prayer, now we talked about prayer last week about the treatment. What's the first step of treatment? That acknowledgement, right? That acknowledgement of recognition of the divine. And that first space that we spend all of our attention in knowing that we're one with that infinite source. When we're one with that, we're one with all. We realize that we're not our bodies. We live in bodies, but we are not our bodies. We're infinite. We're not our minds. We're not everything we think. We have thoughts, but we own them. We create them, and we have control over them. I'm not my emotional body. I have an emotional body. I feel things. I make myself not wrong for feeling things. But after I experience myself feeling things, I will go into treatment and say, okay, was I feeling fear? Was I feeling anger? Was I feeling, fury? And why is that? And allow that space of the divine to open up. And I call on Spirit. Spirit, I know you're knocking at my door. And I open up. And I open up with absolute surrender. I open up with absolute abandon. And I trust. I trust that all is well in my world. I trust that since I know that God only has love for me, and I know that God is searching for me, knocking at my door, calling out for me to open up, then I know that I can do that in absolute trust. And when I have that absolute trust, then all of that spirit flows down through the seed, through the soil to manifest the beautiful plant that we planted. I know that these are really basic concepts, but I think it's important for us to remind ourselves. It's important for us to remind ourselves of how much Spirit is in love with us. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that when we have these tools, that they are absolutely for us, and that we can give up doubt, and we can give up doubting ourselves, and we can give up believing in circumstances as if life goes the other way. You know, sometimes we take our circumstances and we're over here in the manifestation and we live in the realm of the corporeal, world. And we live in the realm of this is what's happening and this is what the bills look like and this is what the relationship looks like. We live in that realm like that's the truth. When in actuality, we start at the top. We start with spirit and allow it to manifest.